I've been invited to come and speak for this. It's called a Mission Week, so I'm speaking tonight. I've been given the topics to speak on. I'm speaking tomorrow afternoon up at the SU on porn and masturbation. What does the Bible say about that? What's the Christian perspective on it? And then in the evening on something I can't remember what it is, and then not Wednesday, but somebody else on Wednesday, and then I'm back here again on Thursday night and Friday night as well, different topics. You're going to list them all off, or do it at the end? Fantastic. So I've been asked to speak on this. The title is it okay not to be okay? And what does the Bible say about my mental health? What a question. Is it okay not to be okay? It depends why you're not okay, I suppose. I'm not a clinical psychologist. I'm not qualified to speak on this. So I'm not going to speak to you from a scientific or psychological perspective, although I do know some things about it, but that's not what I'm qualified in. I'm a pastor, a minister, and so I teach the Bible, and I teach what the Bible says about all things, and so that's what I'm going to do. However, I do have experience with mental health. So I want to share my life with you and my struggle with mental health. And I'm sure that there are many here who have struggled with mental health, or you are struggling with mental health issues. And if you haven't yet, you might. I hope not. If you've not struggled with mental health issues, you probably know somebody who does or has. It is especially rife at the moment because of the effects of lockdown and the COVID and all this in university. In cities, for example, where there are tall bridges, in some cities they've got to put a net underneath it because the students feel under so much pressure that they feel suicidal, and some go ahead and take their own lives. So it's a very serious topic, and I don't want to... If you were here when I spoke at the Mini Mission Week, I pulled people's legs and told a lot of jokes. I might not do so much of that tonight. I don't know, see how it goes. But it's an issue, a topic that is close to my heart, because I have and do struggle with mental health. And so I want to tell you my experience, and then say some facts about mental health, and then tell you what the Bible has to say about it, and offer to you, whether you struggle with mental health or not, the hope that the Bible gives, which is where I find my comfort and where I think the answer to all of life's problems really is in the Scriptures, in the Bible, and having a reconciled relationship with God through Jesus Christ. So here we go. I am naturally rebellious. I don't like to be told what to do, Dixie, and I grew up in a family, a nuclear family, mum, dad, three of us, two brothers, and my mum had an affair, and so they went through a divorce, and I became a very rebellious person. And so any time I felt vulnerable or challenged or in a situation that I could not control, I would just flip. And I'd get angry, and I'd fight in school, I'd fight on the streets, in the house I'd punch doors. There's still doors in my mum's house that has cracks on it. That was my deep way of dealing with vulnerability. But when I was 16, it's a long story as to how this happened. I became a Christian, and God changed my life. And over time, the way that I dealt with vulnerability, it's changed. I was no longer angry. I get angry, of course. I'm angry at a lot of things, but not to the extent that I used to. I don't deal with vulnerability by losing my temper anymore. And so what happened to me is I lost my coping mechanism. I couldn't cope with being vulnerable. And so at the age of 20, I'm 31 now, 2010, my mum had cancer. And so what I was doing is, I didn't work very much in school, but I wanted to go and study theology, which is study of God and the Scriptures. But in order to do that, I needed to get an A-level. So I was doing what's called an access course. Maybe some of you have done it in order to get to university, access to humanity. So I was studying in college, I'm dealing with my mum who was going through chemotherapy, radiotherapy, so I prepare the meals for her the day before, put it in the fridge, and I'm dealing with that. I had a girlfriend at the time, and that relationship wasn't a good one. And so after about 10 months of going through this, and when my mum was getting better and she was getting back to work, I ended that relationship with, wow, I can see you there, hello. See something in my head. Feeling sometimes you've been stared at. I know you're also, Josh is why are you saying that? Oh, noise in the sound system, fair enough. Well, anyway, where were we? Freaked me out then. So I ended that relationship with my girlfriend, and I'd always looked at people who complained about depression and anxiety as sort of, what's wrong with you? Get over it. We all get sad. We all go through difficult times. Grow up. Deal with it. For boys, I'd say man up. For girls, I'd say pull it together. You know, this is not serious. You can get over this. It's almost attention seeking. That's how I used to view these terms, anxiety and depression. And I used to say that to people, which is very unloving and unkind. But when all this happened and that relationship ended, and having to deal with my mother, you've heard this expression before, I hit the wall. And I was just crying, and I couldn't get out of bed in the morning. And so I failed, of course I stopped going to college, and I thought my life was over, because in order to go to college to study theology, I had to pass this course, and I just felt that what God was calling me to do, it was not going to happen. So then I was questioning and doubting God. Does it even exist? What's going on? And my mind was playing tricks with me, and it came to the point where I was hallucinating because I wasn't sleeping. I lost my appetite, and I felt incredibly, incredibly depressed. I don't know how long this went on for. I think my mind has blocked a lot of that experience out, but my mum tells me that it was horrendous. So I was living with my mum at this time. I was 20 years old. So I phoned my mum when she was in work, and just broke down and told her what was going on. And she said, you need to go and see the doctor. So I went to see the doctor, and he said he diagnosed me with clinical depression, is what he said. So he put me on fluoxetine tablets. So I took that for a number of years. That was my first ever encounter with mental health. Really struggling to pull myself together, to feel okay, to feel hope. It was dark, and it was no hope, no aspirations, didn't want to eat. I just wanted to die. Have you ever felt so incredibly sick where you're vomiting, and you just think, if I could die now, that would be good? Have you been so ill? It was like that, but I wasn't ill. I was incredibly depressed. And that was a trigger. And since then, almost every year, I have fallen into a state of serious anxiety. It got so bad once that I didn't know what was going on. I was pacing, I was hyperventilating, I was crying uncontrollably, I was screaming into my pillow. And Libby and I, we got together in 2013, and she was excellent. She didn't understand what was going on and why I was going through this, but she was very supportive, and she'll tell you how bad it went. And I'm sure you've heard of Robin Williams. I think he took his life, I think it was 2013 or 14. And it was the first time that I ever understood why somebody would end their own life. It felt peaceful. I understood it. And it became a desire, and that frightened the life out of me, because I knew that I didn't want to live anymore. I knew that I would prefer to die than to live. And I was almost afraid of my own thoughts. I was terrified about thinking. I was terrified about going to bed in the evening, because I knew I had to get up. And getting up was horrible and difficult. I would not get up. I would cry in bed. I would sweat, and I wouldn't eat. It really was horrible. The episodes would last about 3 weeks, and then for some reason I would come out of it, and everything was okay again. So that was my life for quite a while. And in 2014 I got married to Libs, and we went on our honeymoon. And I remember looking at my wedding ring and feeling the overwhelming sense of responsibility as a husband. And I found it difficult to look at it for days. And when we went on our honeymoon, we went to Malta, and the hotel room wasn't the hotel room I booked. It's our honeymoon. You know what happens on honeymoon. You don't want to be in the room next to the reception. You understand what I'm saying? But that's the room that we were put in. It was 2 single beds. You don't want 2 single beds. And Libby was really upset, and that triggered me. And that was it. I broke down. And I was in this country, Malta. It was piping hot. I was sweating. I couldn't stop crying. Libby was fantastic. She managed to book a flight back to Birmingham, even though we went from Bristol. And it was very complicated. We went to a doctor's there, and they put me on diazepam, which is Valium. And so I stayed on that for a while. And so when we got home, I had what's called a crisis team come visit me, which is when you're they're worried that you're going to be a danger to yourself. That they visited me for a few weeks. And so every year this happened. So I was on fluoxetine, and then they ended up putting me on what's called escitalopram. I was on that for many, many years. 2019, when I became a pastor in Caerwent, after about 2 years, I fell again into a very, very deep depression and anxiety. And these, worse than that, it was just incredibly terrifying. I just wanted to end things. And Libby was great, and she got in touch with a Christian psychiatrist. And he put me then in touch with a clinical psychologist, and I've been seeing her ever since. I see her once every 6 months now, just to talk and make sure everything is okay, and put me on different medication, sertraline, which I take sertraline now. I take 100 milligrams a day. I was on propranolol, which is beta blockers, for 8 years. I've come off them. And I'll probably be on them for the rest of my life. So I understand what it is to go through that. If you're going through it, I'm not you, and I don't understand what you're going through, but I can relate. I can relate to how you feel, and those feelings that come to it, will come with it. 1 in 6 people experienced a common mental disorder in the past week. 1 in 4 people, so a quarter of people, experienced a common mental disorder in the past year. So it's like the 25% of you in this room have struggled with mental health issues in the last year. In 2013, which is what I was referring to when I was particularly unwell, there were 8.2 million cases of anxiety in the UK. Only 1 in 8 adults with mental health problems are currently getting any kind of treatment. 1 in 8, only 1 in 8 get any kind of treatment at all. 1 in 5 people have suicidal thoughts. 1 in 5 of us in this room have had suicidal thoughts. 1 in 14 people actually self-harm. 1 in 15 people attempt suicide. That's a very, very high number. So the question I've been told to answer is, what does the Bible say about mental health? Is it okay not to be okay? My answer is, it depends why you're not okay. There are lots of different diagnoses for anxiety and depression. Here are a few. There's something called mixed anxiety and depression, which I think is what I had. There is generalized anxiety disorder called GAD, post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, just general depression. Phobias come into it, obsessive compulsive disorder, which is OCD, get very intrusive thoughts with that illness. Panic disorder, antisocial personality disorder, which is ASPD, borderline personality disorder, which is BPD, bipolar disorder, psychotic disorders such as schizophrenia, for example. It's difficult to diagnose mental health because you can't take a blood test. If I go to the doctors, I say, if you're physically unwell, then take a blood test. And they'll trace your blood, and they'll be able to tell you, this is a problem, you've got a thyroid problem. So in order to fix this problem, you have to do A, B, and C. But with a mental health issue, it's not black and white, because you can't take a blood test. You diagnose somebody based on their symptoms. And so they ask questions, how do you feel? Explain to me what you're going through. And so estimates of these disorders and the diagnoses can vary quite a bit. There are lots of symptoms, lots of appetite, frustration, anxiety, sweating, panics, pacing, agitation, crying, unable to get up in the morning, no motivation, a feeling of worthlessness, isolation. All of these are symptoms of a deeper issue. So the question I want to ask is, why are you not okay? And in order to answer that question, why are you not okay, I want to give some examples of people in the Bible who struggled with anxiety to show why they were not okay and how their issues were resolved. So I want to begin with a guy called Job. He's a biblical character. Now, here's a man who lost everything. Everything. He was a rich man and everything was lost. Even his wife basically told him, "You're better off dead, mate." That's basically what she said. "You're better off dead. There's no hope for you. You've lost everything." And he suffered so badly that he wished that he was not born. There's a book in the Bible called Job, and in chapter 3, verse 11, this is what Job says. "Why did I not die at birth, or come out of the womb and expire?" He wished he was never born. He had nothing good going for him. He only had pain and turmoil. Again, in chapter 3, verse 26 of Job, he says, "I am not at ease, nor am I quiet. I have no rest, but trouble comes from everywhere." He also confessed that he hated his own life. Job 10, verse 1, he says, "I loathe my life. I will give free utterance to my complaint. I will speak in the bitterness of my soul." He says that he hated the darkness. Job 30, 15 to 17, he says, "Terrors are turned upon me. My horror is pursued as by the wind, and my prosperity, the things that I have, has passed away like a cloud. And now my soul is poured out within me. Days of affliction have taken hold of me. The night racks my bones, and the pain that gnaws me takes no rest." And he had a support group. I don't know if you've ever read Job. He had 3 friends, and they're terrible friends. Terrible friends, terrible advice. And so a support group were anything else but helpful. They actually blamed him for being depressed and anxious. They literally said to him, "To be fair, you're better off dead than going through what you're going through. It's probably your fault." So Job's biggest issue was what was going on inside his own mind. He was predicting that more terrible things were going to happen to him. If you ever struggle with anxiety, it's always predictive. You are predicting that something bad is going to happen. You might not be able to identify what it is, but with special help and care by psychologists, you can help to identify what those things are. I've been there, and I've done that. Job thought that God was against him. That's what he thought, but he was wrong about that. But that's what he thought. He thought that he was going through this because God hated him. But he was wrong. If you read the story of Job, it's the devil that did this to him. It's Satan that did this to him, not God. And so this is always a terrible thing to do during your struggle with anxiety or depression, is to predict unreasonable things, or to think the worst of God, to think that he is responsible for what I'm going through. He isn't responsible. That would be repeating Job's problem. So in Job's situation, it was understandable for him to be stressed because he'd lost everything. Nothing was going well for him. He was understandably depressed and anxious because of what had happened to him. But he made it worse with his wrong understanding of who God was. That made it worse. With a right understanding of who God is, it would have helped him. There's another man in the Bible called David, King David. All that you need to do to discover the complexities of his mental health is to read the book of Psalms. He writes a lot about his anguish, his loneliness, his fears, his sins, and his guilt and the shame that he feels. He writes about grief as well, going through grief and losing loved ones, loneliness. He brought a plague upon the people because of an unauthorized census. He basically went off with another man's wife, and he was confronted about this, and he felt terrible about it and incredibly depressed about his own doing. So he felt this way because he had done something wrong. Different to Job. Job was depressed and anxious because of something that had happened to him, and his bad prediction, and his wrong understanding of who God was. But David, lots of his anxiety, it was his own fault. He brought it upon himself. It was a result of doing something he shouldn't have done. And so he was ridden with guilt and shame. A perfect example of him feeling this way in Psalm 13, verses 1 to 2, he says, "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I take counsel in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all the day?" So the reason for his mental health issue was because he put himself in awkward positions and he did things that he shouldn't have done, and so it brought these feelings upon him. The last biblical character I want to talk about who suffered with anxiety is Jesus. Jesus battled with anxious thoughts and feelings. And this might come as a shock to some Christians, because there are verses in the Bible that says things like, do not be anxious about anything. And so Christians will sometimes judge anxiety as a sin, as it's something, if you feel anxious, that you shouldn't feel anxious. You should trust in God. And so if you're anxious, it means you're not trusting in God, but that's not true. The New Testament was originally written in Greek. And so when you translate something from another language, there's inevitably going to be some interpretation in it. So the Greek word for anxiety or anxious is merinao. In certain contexts, it's translated as anxious. But in two other verses, I haven't got it written down, come see me at the end and I'll find it if you want to know, it's translated as care. So in some places it tells you shouldn't be anxious, but in other places that same word for anxiety is said you should be anxious about somebody. Paul says it in Philippians about Timothy. He says he is anxious about your well-being. He cares about your well-being. And so anxiety isn't necessarily a sin or something that is wrong. The question is, why are you anxious? In David's case, because he did something wrong. Jesus, his feelings of anxiety, they're most clearly seen and expressed when he was in a place called the Garden of Gethsemane. Now, if you know anything about the story of Jesus, he knew that he had to die on the cross. He knew that he had to be handed over to the Roman government so that he could be crucified on the cross, which was a popular way of killing people, executing people in those days. And so leading up to this, he knew this would happen. And he took his disciples with him to a place called the Garden of Gethsemane, the Garden on the Mount of Olives. And he prayed there. And in his prayer, this is what happens. It's recorded in Mark 14, verses 34 and 36. It says this. And Jesus said to his disciples, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch." And going a little further, he fell on the ground and prayed, "If it is possible, that the hour might pass from him." And he said, "Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me, yet not that I will, but as you will." The same account is found in Luke 22, verse 44. This is what it says here. "And being in agony, Jesus prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling to the ground." It is physically possible to sweat drops of blood. To do so, you have to have a certain condition, or you have to be in such a dreadful, sorrowful, anxious position as the one that Jesus was in. And so for me as a Christian, to know that my God, my Father who sent his Son, Jesus the God-man, he himself went through the feelings, the thought, and the experiences that I've gone through is really, really comforting. The first step you should do when you struggle with mental health is to tell somebody. Tell somebody you love and trust, especially for you men, the boys in the back there, and some here as well, is to be honest about it and to share it with somebody. That is a good step, and it's comforting, perhaps, to know that somebody else has gone through something similar. Well, I know that my God, my Saviour, having become man, felt so sorrowful that he sweat drops of blood. The thoughts and feelings that Jesus was feeling was entirely human. He was and is a man, the God-man. He was predicting terrible things because he knew it would happen. That's what anxiety is. He's predicting a terrible event happening on the cross. And so it's causing this incredible amount of anxiety. Now, it's not a lack of faith in his Father. It's not a lack of trust in his Father. It's simply knowing what he is about to face. That's what he's going through. So I've had times when I've been like Job, where bad things have happened to me. I've not brought them upon myself. My mum having cancer, I didn't do that. It just happened. If you've lost your, some of you work, if you lose your job, or you get redundancy, your parents go through similar things, if you're diagnosed with something, you can't help the way you feel almost, because life is uncertain, and it brings upon you things that you have not been taught how to deal with. And so you will inevitably fall, perhaps, into a mental health issue where you are unable to deal with this or control with this. And you find yourself, I can't eat, and you feel sorry for yourself, and you feel worthless. All these feelings come crashing in, and you haven't done anything to contribute to this. It's just happened because a situation. Now, if you came to me at the end and you said, I am incredibly depressed, and I said, well, do you know why? I said, well, and you said, I'm £20,000 in debt. I said, well, that's a massive amount. And you all probably will be, if you take a student loan as I am, but it's not the kind of debt, it's all right, you can pay that off. But some people get into so much debt that they are, the interest that they have to pay, they'll always be in debt. And so their anxiety is because of that. Now, the cure to that problem is to what? Give them £20,000. But I can't do that. I can't remove the problem. But what we can do is to deal with how they're dealing with it, is to help them as they deal with that. That's something that they perhaps brought upon themselves. Not all. Debt isn't always something that isn't always the person's fault who's in debt. But I've had times when I've been like David, that I've been anxious because of guilt and shame, that I've done something. And I'm so ashamed of it that it's caused me to fall into a deep depression. I've been anxious because of criticism that I've received. I've been anxious because of a physical illness. I've been depressed because of dreadful loneliness. I've also been anxious without having any idea why I'm feeling this way. But I thank God that I will never be anxious for the reasons that Jesus was anxious. Because what Jesus was about to do is he was about to go to the cross for a reason. And it was his choice to do that. Because the Bible speaks that we are all broken. I'm talking about a mental health issue. This is a result of what Christians refer to as the fall. The fact that the place is a mess. And we came down here today, that sea is beautiful. It was just wonderful. But at other times, it is terrifying. It's not always beautiful. We had a storm last week. I'm glad I wasn't here, but the places are closed and the sea is beautiful, but it can be terrifying if you catch it in the wrong place. And so the world is wonderful, but it's also terrifying and horrible. There's a darkness to this world, and that affects us, but there's also a darkness to us, where we contribute to that brokenness. We sin, that's what the Bible calls it. We do things. We hurt other people as well as be hurt by other people. And so, because of this brokenness, what the Bible teaches us is that God has to fix this. And the way to do that is by sending his Son, in order to give us a reconciled relationship with God. So he came in order to pay the price for our sins. If I punch Josh at the end, I'm going to be arrested, aren't I? Unless you don't like it. I'll probably take, depending on how bad it was. You might punch him back, you might get in trouble as well. Self-defense, that will be it. What I'm making is, there's consequences to the wrong things that I do, even in this land. We like justice. Some people get away with things, but not with God. You cannot get away with anything. Somebody has to take the punishment for us, which is Jesus. And so he went through this anguish in our place. And that's why I love God. Because he did this for me. And what's striking about these examples that I've given you is that the only person God had left to suffer alone was his own Son, Jesus. And Jesus willingly did that so that we would never be alone. So whatever it is that you do face, that you will face, that you have faced, it is horrible, and it will cause depression and anxiety. That is inevitable in this life, really. But that doesn't mean that you have to be alone. I'll share this with you. When there was one time that I was a Christian, as I was going through these horrible things, and Libby used to lead a camp up in Bala, and I wasn't going, but she'd asked me to prepare to type up hymns, because they sing hymns in these services, right? So I was typing up these hymns, and it was something for me to do while I was deep in this depression, and I was crying as I was doing it, and I got to this hymn, which is called "Oh, to see the dawn of the darkest day, Christ on the road to Calvary," which is the place where the cross is. And if anybody looked at it, you thought, well, he's lost his mind, because I just started singing it. It was just me in the room. I was in my pants as well, but I just started singing, and tears. Have you ever sung when you're crying? It sounds like weird, you feel weird, but that didn't fix my anxiety, but it helped, because I knew that it broke the silence. I knew that God understands, that God will bring me through this. He will be with me. I can speak to him. He understands, because Jesus went through worse. Christ was afflicted with death to give us life and freedom from our sin and sorrows. We have a God who understands. We have a God who is near. He is close. He is here. He didn't condemn. He doesn't condemn us for our questions. He doesn't tell us to get over it. He reaches down to us by coming to us and entered into the deepest pit of suffering. And Christ, even in our deepest sorrow that can ever be felt through his own death, he rose from the dead. And that's what he can do to you and to me. My greatest hope, even though I've had help with medication and with psychological help, my greatest help, and my wife as well, my greatest help has come from God. In knowing him and having a reconciled relationship with him. It might not fix it, it might. But at least he is there, and he's someone who understands everything about you to the greatest detail. So my last and final question is to ask you. So I've asked, the question that's been asked of me is it okay not to be okay? And I've said, it depends why you're not okay. What does it mean to be okay? Why are you not okay? But my last question is, well, how long are you planning on not being okay? Well, I don't know, I can't help it. When you're in the midst of that darkness, remember that God's hope can be spotlighted, so that even when all else seems helpless, God is not. When everything else seems like it's leaving you and departed from you and worthless, God tells you you're not worthless. God tells you, I love you. When you don't think anybody else loves you, I love you. When you doubt whether you should even continue with your own life, God says, no, you should. I have given you life. There's enjoyment to life. I will help you through this. And there's lots of other help available as well. So I'm speaking to you from a spiritual perspective as a pastor, but there is also things that you could do. So let me end by saying this. If you want to talk to me after, come and talk to me. I might be able to point you in the right direction. Generally speaking, the state tells us to do 3 things. Well, I'd say first thing is to go and see the doctor, right? If you feel that you struggle with this. 3 things. Exercise helps a great deal. You think, well, you don't. I know, but that's the one place where I'm lacking. Number 2 is medication can help. Don't be afraid of medication. Speak to the doctor, seek professional advice. And then number 3 is something that's called cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. It's not counselling. They are strategies to help you understand what you're going through and help you to be able to deal with it. That's something I've done. So I've done all 3. Exercise, I gave up on. Medication, I have done. I've taken various ones, and I found one and a dose that works for me. And then number 3 is CBT, which I've had professional help. But there is, of course, a 4th, which is overarches and eclipses all else, which is coming to know Jesus as your Saviour. Because that can sometimes be the real despair, is not knowing whether there is a God, not knowing why you exist, what is the purpose of life. And that could cause incredible, incredible distress. But there is an answer to that. And I'm here all week to answer all kinds of questions. A bit random tomorrow, I'm talking about porn. If you struggle with porn, come tomorrow afternoon, and then in the evening is Dixie Taylor bit. I can't remember. I'm very good, I just can't remember what's all there. So, anyway, there we go. Thanks for listening.